welcome, and thank you for being here. If you're settling in for the night, or simply looking for a moment of calm, you've come to the right place. Tonight, we're going to explore something that's been happening since long before any of us were born. Something so vast and so gentle that it shapes the very edges of our world twice every single day. We're going to talk about tides, about the moon's invisible pull on Earth's oceans, and about the quiet forces that connect our planet to the sky above. So go ahead and get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop, take a slow breath in, and as you breathe out, let yourself begin to drift into this journey with me. If you enjoy this kind of content, I'd love it if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. But for now, just relax. Let's begin. Imagine, if you will, standing on a beach. It's early morning, maybe, or late afternoon. The kind of hour when the light is soft and the world feels a little slower. You're barefoot, and the sand is cool beneath your feet. You watch the waves roll in, one after another, each one reaching a little farther up the shore, then pulling back, leaving behind a dark, wet line. You might not think much of it in that moment. Waves are just waves. After all, the ocean breathes in and out, and that's simply what oceans do. But if you were to stay there, hour after hour, you'd notice something. The waves don't stay in the same place. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the water creeps higher. It inches closer to where you're standing. Shells and bits of driftwood that were dry a little while ago are now being nudged by the surf. The tide is coming in, and if you wait long enough, you'll see it reverse. The water will retreat, pulling back down the beach, exposing rocks and tide pools and stretches of sand that were hidden beneath the waves. This rising and falling, this slow, steady breathing of the ocean is what we call the tide. And it's one of the most reliable, most predictable rhythms on our entire planet. Tides are not just waves. Waves are created by wind, by storms, by the friction of air moving across the surface of the water. They come and go in seconds. But tides are something deeper. Tides are the result of gravity, the invisible force that holds the moon in orbit around the Earth, that keeps our planet circling the Sunday, that binds the entire universe together. The moon, hanging there in the sky, so far away that it takes light more than a second to travel from its surface to ours, is pulling on the Earth. And the Earth, in turn, is pulling on the moon. This pull, this gravitational embrace, is what creates the tides. It's a dance that's been going on for billions of years, long before there were beaches to walk on, long before there were people to notice, and it will continue long after we're gone. Let's start with the basics, because even though tides are something most of us have seen, understanding exactly how they work requires us to slow down and think about forces we can't see. Gravity is one of those forces. You feel it every moment of your life. It's what keeps your feet on the ground, what makes a dropped object fall. But gravity doesn't just pull things down toward the center of the Earth. Gravity is a force that acts between any two objects that have mass. The Earth pulls on you, and you pull on the Earth. The moon pulls on the Earth, and the Earth pulls on the Moon. The Sunday pulls on both of them. Everything in the universe is pulling on everything else all the time. The strength of that pull depends on two things. The more massive an object is, the stronger its gravitational pull, and the closer two objects are to each other, the stronger the pull between them. This is why you don't feel the Moon's gravity pulling you up into the sky. The Moon is massive, yes, far more massive than any mountain or any city, but it's also very far away. The Earth, on the other hand, is right beneath your feet, so the Earth's gravity wins, and you stay firmly on the ground. But the oceans are different. The oceans are fluid. They can move, they can flow, they can respond to forces in ways that solid rock cannot. And so, even though the Moon's gravity is much weaker than the Earth's gravity, it's still strong enough to pull on the oceans, not enough to lift the water up into space. Of course, but enough to create a bulge, a slight swelling of the ocean on the side of the Earth that faces the Moon. This is the beginning of the tide. Picture the Earth, a blue sphere covered in water, spinning slowly in space. The Moon is off to one side, pulling on that water. The water on the side of the Earth closest to the Moon feels the Moon's gravity more strongly than the water on the far side because it's closer. And so the ocean on the near side bulges outward toward the Moon. This creates what we call a high tide. If you're standing on a beach on that side of the Earth, you'll see the water level rise. The waves will reach higher up the shore. The tide is coming in, but here's where it gets interesting, and maybe a little counterintuitive. There's also a bulge on the opposite side of the Earth, the side facing away from the Moon. You might think that the water there would be pulled less, that it would sink down, creating a low tide. But that's not what happens. Instead, there's a second high tide on the far side of the Earth as well. Why? Because gravity doesn't pull evenly on everything. The Moon's gravity is strongest on the side of the Earth, closest to it, weaker at the Earth's center, and weakest on the far side. This difference in gravitational pull, this gradient, is what creates the tides. The water on the near side is pulled more strongly toward the Moon than the solid Earth beneath it, so it bulges outward. But the solid Earth is pulled more strongly than the water on the far side. So the Earth, in a sense, is pulled away from the water on the far side, leaving that water behind. The result is two bulges, one on each side of the Earth, both pointing along the line that connects the Earth and the Moon. These two bulges are the high tides, and in between them, at the points on the Earth that are 90 degrees away from the Moon, the water level is lower. These are the low tides. Now, the Earth is spinning. It rotates once every 24 hours, turning beneath these two bulges of water. As it spins, different parts of the Earth's surface pass through the high tide bulges and the low tide troughs. If you're standing on a beach, you'll experience this as the tide coming in and going out, roughly every 12 hours. Your location on the Earth will pass through one of the high tide bulges, and the water will rise. Then, about 6 hours later, you'll be in one of the low tide zones, and the water will recede. 6 hours after that, you'll pass through the second high tide bulge, and the water will rise again, and so on in a rhythm that repeats twice a day, every day, as long as the moon is in the sky. This is why most places on Earth experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides each day. It's not because the moon is moving around the Earth that quickly. The moon takes about a month to orbit the Earth, but the Earth is spinning much faster. And as it spins, we move through the tidal bulges that the moon creates. Of course, the actual timing is a little more complicated than exactly 12 hours. The moon is also moving in its orbit around the Earth, in the same direction that the Earth is spinning. So by the time a spot on the Earth has rotated once and is facing the same direction again, the moon has moved a little bit farther along in its orbit. The Earth has to rotate a little bit more to catch up, to line up with the moon again. This extra rotation takes about 50 minutes. So the time between one high tide and the next is not exactly 12 hours. It's more like 12 hours and 25 minutes. This is why, if you check the tide tables for your local beach, you'll notice that high tide happens a little bit later each day. The tides follow the moon, and the moon is always moving, always shifting its position in the sky. Let's take a moment to think about what this means on a human scale. If you live near the ocean, you know the tides. You know that there are times when the beach is wide and the water is far out, and times when the waves are lapping at the base of the cliffs or the seawall. You know that if you want to explore tide pools, you have to go at low tide, when the rocks are exposed and the little pools of water are full of sea stars and anemones and tiny crabs. You know that if you're launching a boat, you need to pay attention to the tide, because a harbor that's deep enough at high tide might be too shallow at low tide. Fishermen know the tides. Sailors know the tides. Anyone who spends time by the sea learns to read the rhythm of the water, to feel the pulse of the ocean as it rises and falls. And all of this daily predictable movement is because of the moon. The moon, which seems so distant, so untouchable, is reaching across the emptiness of space and moving the oceans of our world. It's a connection that's both invisible and undeniable, a reminder that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. There's a kind of comfort in that, isn't there? In knowing that the tides have been rising and falling for billions of years, long before there were humans to witness them. The first tides happened when the Earth was still young, when the moon was closer than it is now, when the days were shorter and the tides were higher. Back then, the moon's pull was even stronger, because the moon was nearer. Over the eons, the moon has been slowly drifting away from the Earth, moving outward at a rate of about 1.5 inches every year. It's a tiny amount, imperceptible in a human lifetime, but over millions and billions of years, it adds up. The moon used to loom much larger in the sky. The tides used to be much more dramatic. But even now, even with the moon farther away, the tides are still here. They're still reliable. They're still a part of the rhythm of our planet, and they will continue to be for as long as the moon and the Earth exist. So when you stand on that beach, watching the waves, you're witnessing something ancient. You're seeing the result of forces that have been at work since the very beginning. The water at your feet is responding to the moon, just as it has always responded, just as it always will. And there's something deeply soothing about that. In a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable, the tides are a constant. They rise and they fall. They come in and they go out, and they do it with a regularity that you can set your watch by. The moon pulls, the earth spins, and the ocean breathes. It's a simple truth, and it's a beautiful one. Now, let's go a little deeper. We've talked about the moon creating two bulges of water, one on the near side of the earth and one on the far side. And we've talked about how the earth's rotation carries us through these bulges, giving us two high tides and two low tides each day. But Therese, more to the story. Because the tides aren't just caused by the moon, the Sunday plays a role as well. The Sunday is much, much more massive than the moon. In fact, the Sunday is about 27 million times more massive than the moon. And because of that enormous mass, the sun's gravitational pull on the earth is actually much stronger than the moon's. If you were to measure the total gravitational force that the Sunday exerts on the earth, it would be about 178 times greater than the force the moon exerts. So why doesn't the Sunday dominate the tides? Why do we talk about the moon as the primary cause of tides, rather than the Sunday? The answer, once again, comes down to distance. The Sunday is very far away. It's about 93 million miles from the Earth, which is roughly 390 times farther away than the moon. And remember, tides are not caused by the overall strength of gravity. They're caused by the difference in gravity from one side of the Earth to the other. They're caused by the gravitational gradient. The sun's gravity is strong, yes, but because the Sunday is so far away, that gravity doesn't change very much from one side of the Earth to the other. The difference in the sun's pull on the near side of the Earth versus the far side is relatively small. The moon, on the other hand, is much closer. And because it's closer, the difference in its gravitational pull from one side of the Earth to the other is much larger. The moon's gravitational gradient is steeper. And so, even though the sun's overall gravity is stronger, the moon's tidal force, the force that actually creates the bulges in the ocean, is about twice as strong as the sun's. But the sun's tidal force is still significant. It's not negligible. The Sunday creates its own set of tidal bulges, just like the moon does, and these solar tides interact with the lunar tides. Sometimes they add together, and sometimes they partially cancel each other out. This interaction is what creates the monthly cycle of stronger and weaker tides that we observe. Let's think about what happens during a new moon. At new moon, the moon is between the Earth and the Sunday. From our perspective on Earth, the moon and the Sunday are in the same part of the sky. We can't see the moon during the day because it's too close to the Sunday. And at night, the side of the moon facing us is dark. But even though we can't see it, and because the moon and the Sunday are aligned, their tidal forces add together. The bulge created by the moon and the bulge created by the Sunday are in the same place. The result is a higher high tide and a lower low tide than usual. The tidal range, the difference between high tide and low tide, is at its maximum. We call these spring tides. Now, the name spring tide has nothing to do with the season of spring. It comes from the Old English word springen, which means to leap or to rise up. Spring tides are the tides that leap higher, that rise farther up the beach. They happen twice a month, at new moon and at full moon. At full moon, The Earth is between the moon and the Sunday. The moon and the Sunday are on opposite sides of the Earth. But even though they're on opposite sides, their tidal forces still add together because the tidal bulges point along the Earth-Moon line and the Earth-Sunday line, and those lines are aligned. So at full moon, just like at new moon, we get spring tides. Higher highs, lower lows, a greater tidal range. About a week after new moon, the moon reaches first quarter. At first quarter, the moon is 90 degrees away from the Sunday, as seen from Earth. If the Sunday is setting in the west, the moon is high in the southern sky. The moon and the Sunday are at right angles to each other, and when this happens, their tidal forces don't add together. Instead, they partially cancel each other out. The bulge created by the moon is in one direction, and the bulge created by the Sunday is in a perpendicular direction. The result is a smaller tidal range. The high tides are not as high, and the low tides are not as low. We call these neap tides. The word neap comes from an Old English word meaning barely touching or scanty. Neap tides are the modest tides, the tides that don't reach as far. They happen twice a month, at first quarter and at third quarter, when the moon and the Sunday are at right angles. So over the course of a month, the tides go through a cycle. At new moon, spring tides, with a large tidal range. A week later, at first quarter, neap tides, with a smaller range. Another week later, at full moon, spring tides again. And then at third quarter, neap tides once more. This fortnightly cycle, this 2-week rhythm of stronger and weaker tides, is something that people who live by the sea are very familiar with. If you're planning a beach outing, or if you're a fisherman heading out to sea, you pay attention to the phase of the moon. You know that the tides will be more extreme around the new and full moons, and more moderate around the quarter moons. It's a pattern that's been observed and recorded for thousands of years. Long before anyone understood the physics behind it, ancient cultures knew the tides followed the moon. They built calendars around the lunar cycle. They timed their fishing and their sailing and their planting by the phases of the moon. And they were right to do so, because the moon's influence on the tides is real and measurable. Let's pause for a moment and think about what it would be like to experience these different tides. Imagine you're back on that beach, and it's the night of a new moon. The sky is dark, with no moon visible, but the stars are bright. You're standing at the edge of the water, and the tide is coming in. It's a spring tide, so the water is rising higher than it has in the past week. Waves are crashing farther up the beach, reaching places that were dry just a few days ago. You can feel the power of the ocean, the way it surges and pulls. Therese a sense of fullness, of abundance, as if the sea is brimming over. Now, fast forward a week. It's first quarter, and the moon is a half circle in the sky, glowing softly. You're on the same beach, at the same time of day, but the tide is different. It's a neap tide now, and the water isn't rising as high. The waves are gentler, more subdued. The tidal range is smaller, and the ocean feels calmer, more restrained. Therese still a rhythm, still a rise and fall, but it's less dramatic. The sea is breathing more quietly. This monthly cycle of spring and neap tides is one of the ways the moon shapes our experience of the ocean, but it's not the only way. There are longer cycles too. cycles that play out over the course of a year. And to understand those, we need to think about the moon's orbit in a little more detail. The moon doesn't orbit the Earth in a perfect circle. Its orbit is an ellipse, a slightly stretched circle, with the Earth at one of the two focal points. This means that the distance between the Earth and the moon changes over the course of a month. Sometimes the moon is closer to the Earth, and sometimes it's farther away. When the moon is at its closest point, we call that perigee. When it's at its farthest point, we call that apogee. The difference in distance is significant. At perigee, the moon is about 225,000 miles away. At apogee, it's about 252,000 miles away. That's a difference of about 27,000 miles, or roughly 11% of the average distance. And because the moon's tidal force depends on distance, this change in distance affects the tides. When the moon is at perigee, closer to the Earth, its gravitational pull is stronger. The tidal bulges are a little bit larger. The tides are a little bit higher. When the moon is at apogee, farther away, the pull is weaker, and the tides are a little bit lower. The difference is not huge, but it's noticeable. Tides at perigee can be several inches higher than tides at apogee. All else being equal, and if a spring tide happens to coincide with perigee, if the moon is both full or new and at its closest point to the Earth, then you get what's sometimes called a perigean spring tide or a king tide. These are the highest tides of the year, the times when the ocean reaches its farthest extent up the shore. King tides are a natural part of the tidal cycle, and they happen a few times each year. Whenever the timing lines up just right, they're predictable, and they're not dangerous in and of themselves. But they can contribute to coastal flooding, especially if they coincide with storms or high winds or other factors that push water toward the shore. The moon's elliptical orbit is just one of many factors that influence the tides. Terese also the tilt of the Earth's axis, the shape of the ocean basins, the depth of the water, the contours of the coastline. All of these things affect how the tides behave in any given location. In some places, the tides are enormous. The Bay of Fundy on the east coast of Canada has the highest tides in the world. At spring tide, the difference between high tide and low tide can be more than 50 feet. The water rushes in and out of the bay with tremendous force, filling and emptying it twice a day. In other places, the tides are much smaller. In the Mediterranean Sea, for example, the tidal range is often less than a foot. The shape of the sea, the narrow connection to the Atlantic Ocean, the way the water sloshes back and forth, all of these factors combine to dampen the tides. And in some places, to raise only one high tide and one low tide per Dalton Y rather than two. This happens in certain parts of the Gulf of Mexico and in some areas of Southeast Asia where the local geography and the way the tidal waves propagate create a different pattern. But no matter where you are, no matter how large or small the tides are in your part of the world, the underlying cause is the same. It's the moon pulling on the Earth. It's the Sunday adding its influence. It's the spin of the Earth carrying us through the tidal bulges. It's gravity, that invisible force that connects everything in the universe. And it's been happening for so long, for so many billions of years, that it's woven into the very fabric of our planet. The tides have shaped coastlines, carved out bays and estuaries, created habitats for countless species of plants and animals. They've influenced human history, determined where people could build ports and harbors, where they could fish and trade and explore. The tides are a part of us, a part of our world in ways that are both obvious and subtle. So as you lie there, breathing slowly, letting your body relax, think about the tides. Think about the ocean, rising and falling, somewhere out there in the darkness. Think about the moon, hanging in the sky, pulling on the water, shaping the world. Think about the rhythm, the constancy, the ancient dance of gravity and motion, and let that rhythm carry you. Let it soothe you, because just as the tides rise and fall, so too do we have our own rhythms, our own cycles of activity and rest. We have our high tides and our low tides, our moments of fullness and our moments of retreat. And that's okay. That's natural. That's part of being alive. The moon doesn't judge the ocean for rising and falling. It simply pulls, and the ocean responds. And we too can respond to the rhythms of our own lives with that same kind of acceptance, that same kind of grace. The tides teach us that change is constant, but also that there is a pattern to that change, a predictability, a reason, and in that, there is comfort, there is peace. As you lie there, perhaps beginning to feel your own awareness ebb and flow a little, we can follow the tide out from the realm of pure physics and into the world it shapes, the living edge, where land and ocean meet, and where life has learned to move in time with the moon's invisible pull. Because the tides are not just numbers on a chart or curves on a graph. They are a moving frontier, a shifting doorway, and on that threshold entire communities of creatures wake, feed, rest, and hide according to the rise and fall of the sea. If you picture a coastline at low tide, maybe the same beach you imagined earlier, you might see more than just wet sand and scattered rocks. Between the high tide line, that faint border of driftwood, shells and seaweed, and the furthest reach of the low tide, there is a whole zone of life that spends part of its day underwater and part of its day exposed to the air. Scientists call this the intertidal zone, and it is one of the most demanding environments on Earth. It is flooded and drained, cooled and warmed, battered by waves and dried by sun and wind, not just occasionally, but over and over, day after day. Yet, for the right kinds of organisms, it is a place of extraordinary opportunity. Nutrients are constantly being delivered and taken away. Fresh oxygen is swept in with each new tide, and because the water retreats, this world is open to sunlight in a way that most of the ocean never is. If you walk slowly across a rocky shore at low tide, you are really walking across several different neighborhoods, layered one above the other, stacked like soft, irregular terraces down toward the water. High up, near the very limit of the wave's reach, is a zone that is only splashed now and then. Scientists sometimes call it the spray zone. It is more land than sea, more air than water. Here, dark patches of tiny, tightly packed barnacles might crust the rocks like a rough mosaic. These little shell, Covered animals close themselves up like shutters during the long dry hours, trapping a bit of seawater inside to keep from desiccating. A few hardy snails graze on thin films of algae, their shells warming in the sun and cooling again when a gust of spray blows over them. Gulls patrol this land, edge, watching for any careless animal that ventures too far from shelter. A bit lower, you begin to step into the true high intertidal zone, Fay the band that is covered by water at the peaks of the daily high tides, and uncovered for long stretches in between. Life here has to be doubly prepared. It must endure the force of waves when the water comes in, and also the dryness and bright sun when it goes out. Mussels and larger barnacles often dominate this level on rocky coasts, welded so firmly to the stone that even pounding surf cannot pry them free. Their shells are not just armor. They are tiny vaults of stored seawater and protection. When the tide recedes, they clamp down and wait, their world suddenly quiet and filtered. The roar of the underwater surf replaced by the distant hiss of waves on rocks far below. Drop another step down toward the sea, and you reach the mid-intertidal zone, which spends roughly half its time underwater and half exposed. At first glance, it might look like chaos fey rocks slick with seaweed, shallow pools of clear water, scattered shells and fragments of kelp. But if you stop and let your eyes adjust to the pace of this miniature world, details emerge. In the small pools left behind by the ebbing sea fey tide, pools fey, you might find sea anemones, soft and flower, like their tentacles drifting gently in the water. Tiny fish and hermit crabs weave among them, sheltering from larger predators that will return with the next flood. Colorful sea stars cling to the undersides of rocks, or spread their 5, or sometimes more, arms across the stone, slowly moving in search of food. On the sandier parts of the shore, burrowing clams and worms leave delicate traces at the surface, a series of little spirals and holes that tell you where they lie hidden, just below your feet, waiting for the ocean's return. Lower still, just above the line where the sea rarely retreats, lies the low intertidal zone. This area is exposed to the air only at the very lowest tides, Fey, those spring low tides that happen around the new and full moon, when the tidal range is at its greatest. Most of the time, this zone is a shallow underwater shelf, bathed in sunlit water. Forests of seaweed sway here, anchored to rocks by strong holdfasts that grip as firmly as any tree root. Many of the animals living in this zone are more like typical marine creatures, and less like amphibious survivors. Delicate sea slugs, sponges, small fish, and more tender algae can thrive, because they are only briefly exposed to the drying air. Across all of these bands, Fey, spray, high, middle, low, Fey, there is a pattern called vertical zonation, a natural sorting of species by their ability to tolerate stress. Those that can cope with the longest dry spells, the most intense sunlight, and the greatest temperature swings live higher up. Those that need more consistent immersion live lower down. The result is that if you were to kneel and look carefully along the rocks from top to bottom, you would see distinct stripes of life, each with its own characteristic blend of species. Barnacles and hardy snails dominate the upper reaches. Mussels and limpets cluster below them, and further down seaweeds, anemones, and sea stars form dense, living carpets. This pattern appears on coasts all around the world, echoed in many variations, shaped by local wave energy water temperature, the chemistry of the sea, and the shape of the shore. All of this is only possible because the tides act like an enormous, twice daily pump for the coastline. With each incoming tide, fresh ocean water, rich in dissolved oxygen, sweeps into the intertidal zone. It brings with it microscopic plankton, tiny drifting organisms that form the base of the marine food web as well as bits of organic matter stirred up from deeper water. Filter feeders such as mussels, barnacles, and some worms open themselves to this moving buffet, extracting particles from the flow. When the tide retreats, it doesn't just leave emptiness behind, it carries fine sediments and organic debris back out again, redistributing nutrients, sculpting the seabed, and constantly rearranging the contours of sandbars and channels. In a way, each coastline is like a breathing organism. The pattern is not the same everywhere. Along the shores of the Bay of Fundy in eastern Canada, for example, the shape of the bay and the timing of the incoming tidal wave line up in such a way that the water sloshes back and forth in resonance, amplifying the tides. The difference between high and low tide there can exceed 50 feet, transforming harbors from wide basins filled with ships floating at their moorings into deep, muddy hollows where boats rest on the seafloor, their hulls leaning against the dock pilings. In contrast, in nearly landlocked seas like the Mediterranean, the connection to the open ocean is much narrower, and the water does not have as much room to slosh. The result is a much smaller tidal range, often just a foot or less. The moon is still pulling, the Sunday is still adding its influence, but the shape of the basin moderates the response. This interplay of global forces and local shapes means that every shoreline has its own tidal signature. Some coasts, especially those tucked into certain corners of the Gulf of Mexico or parts of Southeast Asia, experience mainly one high and one low tide each day, a diurnal pattern rather than the more common semi-diurnal rhythm of two. Others have mixed tides, where two highs and two lows occur daily, but with noticeably different heights. The fundamental driving forces are the same everywhere. For the animals and plants living along these coasts, tides are not just background scenery. They are the clock by which life is organized. Many crabs time their movements so that they emerge to feed on stranded prey as the tide is falling, scuttling across the wet sand or rocks to snatch up small fish and invertebrates left behind in shrinking pools. Shorebirds, with their long legs and probing beaks, patrol the exposed flats at low tide, feasting on worms and clams that were hidden only hours before. As the tide returns, these birds retreat upslope, sometimes following the rising water line in a slow, graceful dance. Fish that prefer shallow food, rich waters often ride the incoming tide into estuaries and marshes, feeding among flooded grasses and roots, then drift back out on the ebb, carried seaward by the same flow that brought them in. Some species take this synchronization even further, tying critical events in their life. Cycles Fei reproduction, migration, metamorphosis Fei to particular combinations of tide and moon phase. Along certain coasts, there are worms and small crustaceans that swarm into the shallows to spawn only during specific high spring tides, when the water will carry their eggs into sheltered nursery areas, and the extra high water line gives the next generation a bit more buffer from predators. Sea turtles in some regions time their nesting so that their hatchlings' dash to the sea coincides with high tide and darkness, gaining both depth and camouflage within minutes of emerging from the sand. Over many generations, these patterns become woven so tightly into a species' biology that the animals appear to keep time with the moon itself, even though the mechanism often comes down to internal biological clocks, gently tuned by light, tides, and experience. If you imagine yourself standing quietly on that shore, watching all of this unfold, you might notice how deeply human life has also been shaped by the moon-tide connection. Long before anyone knew about gravitational gradients or elliptical orbits, coastal peoples noticed that the sea answered to the moon. They saw that certain harbors were only safely accessible at high tide, when channels deepened enough for a loaded vessel to pass. They learned which beaches would be broad and walkable at low tide, and which remained treacherous or soft. Fishing and shell gathering traditions came to depend on this knowledge. A low tide at dawn in some cultures meant a morning of family foraging on exposed reefs. A spring tide in the evening might mean hauling nets to capture fish riding in with the water. Over time, these observations became woven into calendars and mythologies. Many early calendars were lunar or lunisolar Fei tracking months by the phases of the moon and adjusting to the Sunday's yearly path. In such rhythms, tides were not just marine curiosities, but living demonstrations of the sky's influence on the earth. Some cultures explained the tides as the ocean's longing for the moon, or as the breath of a great sea creature rising and falling beneath the waves. Others developed surprisingly accurate practical rules, knowing that around the new and full moons, tides would be strongest and most useful for navigation or for flushing estuaries. The term spring tides, with its sense of leaping water, reflects that old recognition of just how far the sea can stretch under the combined pull of Sunday and moon. Even now, with satellite navigation and sophisticated tide prediction models, mariners still consult tide tables and charts before setting out. Large cargo ships may need to wait for the tide to rise before they can safely cross the shallow bar at the mouth of a river or enter a port whose channel has limited depth. In some narrow inlets where tidal currents run like rivers, timing is everything. Pass through at slack water, Fei those brief moments when the current pauses as it changes direction. Fei and the transit is uneventful. Attempted at peak flow, and the same passage can become a churning, sideways push of water that strains engines and challenges even experienced pilots. There are also special tidal spectacles that people travel to witness. In certain rivers that meet the sea through narrowing channels, such as the Qiantang River in China, or the mouths of some Amazon tributaries, the incoming tide can form a steep, rolling wall of water called a tidal bore. This wave surges upriver against the natural flow, a dramatic demonstration of how powerful the ocean's pulse can be when funneled the right way. Elsewhere, the highlight is more subtle, a series of shallow tidal flats that transform with each tide from dry, glistening sand to mirror, like sheets of water reflecting the sky. For all its beauty, the tide's force can also combine with other elements to create danger. A king tide, Faye, one of those especially high Perigean spring tides, when the moon is both full or new and near its closest point to Earth. Faye is a perfectly natural event, entirely predictable. On its own, it simply brings the water a little farther up the shore than usual. But if that same tide coincides with a strong onshore wind or a storm surge from a passing cyclone, the result can be severe coastal flooding, with waves reaching roads, homes, and infrastructure that are rarely touched by the sea. As global sea levels rise, even ordinary high tides are climbing bit by bit, turning once rare nuisance flooding into a more frequent visitor in some low-lying coastal cities. And yet, even in this changing world, the fundamental rhythm remains. The moon continues its slow path around the Earth. The Earth continues to spin. The Sunday's distant gravity continues to join or partially oppose the moon's pull. The water answers, swelling and retreating along shorelines all over the globe. In the sheltered stillness of a tide pool, a sea star spreads its arms over a mussel, beginning the patient process of feeding. On a sandy beach, tiny clams feel the cool rush of returning water and begin to extend their siphons, drawing in food. Far offshore, tidal currents mingle with larger ocean flows, helping to redistribute heat and nutrients. As you rest, you might let your awareness move, just like that water, Faye slowly, rhythmically, Faye imagining it washing into all the small inlets and coves of your own inner landscape. There are times in your life, just as along the coast, when everything feels exposed, when the tide seems far away and you are standing in the bright, unforgiving air of change. And there are times when support returns like the rising sea, covering what was laid bare, smoothing the rough edges, bringing in what you need. In the same way that barnacles, mussels, and algae have found their particular places along the rocks, Faye, higher or lower, wetter or drier, Faye, you too have learned where you can stand, what you can tolerate, how you adapt when circumstances shift. The moon does not hurry the oceans, and the oceans do not resist the moon. There is no argument between them, only a steady answering. Twice a day, every day, the water leans toward the sky and then leans back again, without apology for its rising and without shame for its retreat. You are allowed the same grace, whatever kind of tide you are in right now. Faye, whether you feel like you are at high water, full and busy, or at a low, quiet stretch of exposed shoreline, Faye, it is all part of the same larger pattern. Just as the intertidal creatures have evolved to thrive, not in spite of the tides but because of them, you can lean into the idea that your own rhythms, your own cycles of energy and rest, are not flaws to be fixed, but features to be understood and respected. Out there in the darkness beyond your walls, the ocean is moving. Somewhere, waves are sliding higher up a rocky ledge than they did an hour ago, filling tide pools and lifting floating kelp. Somewhere else, the water is draining back, leaving behind glistening sand and a faint, retreating hiss. All of it is being guided, gently but firmly, by the silent geometry of Earth, Moon, and Sunday. As you breathe, you are sharing time with that motion. Each inhale is like a small high tide in the chest. Each exhale, a soft ebb. And as your body settles, as your thoughts grow quieter, you can imagine yourself carried by that same dependable rhythm, supported by the same universal forces that turn the tides and have done so since the world was young. If you'd like, you can let your attention rest there for a while, fey on that image of the shore at dawn or dusk, the line of wet sand, the slow approach or withdrawal of the sea fey, and simply allow the next part of our journey into the moon's influence to arrive as gradually and gently as the next tide. When you are ready, we'll follow that pull a little farther into the deeper history of how tides have shaped our planet over immense stretches of time, and how, in ways not immediately obvious from the edge of the shore, this daily motion has helped make Earth the kind of world where beings like us can fall asleep to the sound of the sea. As the tide continues its slow, patient breathing along the shore, there is a sense that the world has been rocking back and forth like this for so long that even the rocks themselves have learned the rhythm. You can almost imagine the cliffs as old, drowsy guardians who have stood still through millions of high tides and millions of low tides, watching wave after wave paint a soft, dissolving line of white at their feet. The ocean rises, the ocean falls, and every living thing along the coast has quietly built its life around that dependable motion. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, you are lying down, listening, and there is another rhythm that matters just as much, though it is much easier to miss. It is the rhythm inside you. Your lungs have their own slow tide, filling and emptying. Your heart sends its own pulsing waves along rivers of blood. Your body temperature drifts up and down over the day. Even your alertness, your sleepiness, the way your mind feels sharp and then hazy and then ready to dream, follows a kind of inner tide. Scientists call these repeating patterns circadian rhythms, from words that simply mean about a day, because they run on a cycle that is a little over or under 24 hours on their own. Left in constant darkness, with no clocks and no schedules, human bodies still tend to drift into a sleep-wake pattern that is roughly 24 hours long. Deep in the brain, in a tiny region of the hypothalamus, there is a small cluster of nerve cells called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, often abbreviated as the SCN. It sits just above the crossing of the optic nerves, and it acts as a master clock, keeping time for the rest of the body and helping to coordinate many of the rhythms that quietly shape the way you feel throughout the day and the night. This little clock is sensitive to light. Special cells in the retina send information directly to it, not to form images, but to let the brain know how bright or dim the world is. When light hits these cells in the morning and during the day, it tells the SCN that it is daytime, and the clock shifts its timing to stay aligned with the outside world. When the light fades in the evening, the message slowly changes, and the internal clock begins to signal that it is night. One of the most important signals that flows from this clock is a hormone called melatonin, released by a small gland deep in the brain called the pineal gland. Melatonin is often brought up in conversations about sleep, and it is sometimes casually called the sleep hormone. But researchers who study it have found that it is better understood as a darkness signal, rather than a direct switch for sleep. During the day, when your eyes and your brain are bathed in light, the activity of the SCN suppresses melatonin production. As the evening arrives and the light level at your eyes falls, the CN reduces that suppression, and melatonin levels in your blood begin to rise. They usually reach their peak in the middle of the night, roughly in the hours after midnight, and then decline again toward morning. This smooth, nightly wave of melatonin helps your body settle into a nighttime mode. It gently nudges your core body temperature downward, supports the natural tendency to feel drowsy, and helps coordinate many other processes that are more active at night. In that sense, melatonin behaves a little like the pull of the moon on the ocean. It does not create sleep on its own, just as the moon does not create the water out of nothing. Instead, it shapes the timing and the pattern, encouraging certain activities to flow more strongly at certain times and to ebb at others. If you have ever noticed that you feel a distinct wave of sleepiness sometime in the evening, a sense that a door into sleep is opening a little wider, that feeling often coincides with a rising edge in your melatonin levels. Laboratory studies that carefully track people's melatonin rhythms and body temperature have found that when melatonin begins to climb, sleep tends to come more easily, and when it reaches its peak, the depth of sleep often reaches its fullest point a little later in the night. There is another process, though, that works together with this circadian timing. As you stay awake during the day, a kind of sleep pressure gradually builds up in the brain. This homeostatic process is sometimes called process S in the scientific literature, whereas the circadian influence is sometimes called process C. The longer you have been awake, the stronger this sleep pressure becomes. When you finally fall asleep, that pressure eases off, like a tide receding. Taken together, these two overlapping systems mean that sleep is not just an on-off switch. It is more like a carefully choreographed dance between an inner clock and an inner tide of need. When the rhythm of your inner clock and the rise of your inner sleep pressure line up, sleep arrives smoothly and feels refreshing. When they get out of alignment, when the inner moon and the inner tide are pulling in different directions, you can lie still in the dark and feel as if sleep is just out of reach. Many people have felt this misalignment, even without having words for it. You may have felt it after a long flight across time zones, when your body still thinks it is night in one place and day in another, or after a week of late nights and early mornings, when your schedule has drifted away from what your internal clock expects. In those moments, you are like a small harbor, thrown out of sync with the rhythm of the ocean outside. The tides are still moving, but the timing feels strange. This is why simple things like going outside in the morning light and dimming lights in the evening can make such a difference. Morning light helps to anchor the phase of your master clock earlier in the day, encouraging it to signal wakefulness a bit sooner, and to begin the melatonin rise earlier in the evening. Dim, warm light in the evening reduces confusing signals that might otherwise tell your brain it is still daytime, and that, in turn, lets melatonin flow more naturally. It is a quiet, invisible exchange between the world and your brain, a soft conversation between the sky and the tiny timekeeping cells above your optic nerves. Inside you, these rhythms are not limited to sleep and wakefulness. Nearly every organ in the body has its own molecular clockwork, small cycles of activity in the genes and proteins inside cells that follow roughly 24-hour patterns. The liver cycles through different metabolic priorities at different times of day. The heart adjusts its sensitivity and readiness to respond. The immune system shifts its vigilance, sometimes more alert in the day, sometimes more engaged in repair at night. These peripheral clocks take their cues from the master clock in the brain, but they also respond to other signals, such as when you eat, when you move, and how you sleep. When your schedule is fairly regular, your inner oceans tend to align, and there's a sense of ease, as if all the waves inside you are moving in the same direction. You might recall days when you woke naturally at a consistent time, felt reasonably energetic through the day, and became sleepy at a predictable hour in the evening. In those periods, the alignment of your internal tides may have been particularly smooth. When your schedule is chaotic for long stretches, late night screens, meals at odd hours, inconsistent sleep times, it is as though small, choppy waves begin to rattle the surface of each inner pool. The overall tide is still there, but it feels less clear. You do not have to name any of these processes to feel their effects. You simply feel that sometimes your body is working with you, and at other times it seems to resist. In coastal ecosystems, we saw how life has adapted to use the predictability of the tides. Barnacles, mussels, sea stars, and crabs rely on knowing, in a deep biological way, when the water will rise and when it will fall. They do not think about it. They do not plan, and yet their lives are in harmony with that cycle. In a similar way, your cells do not sit down with a calendar. They follow gentle chemical rhythms, turning processes on and off in a sequence that has been shaped by countless generations of humans, living under the regular rising and setting of the Sunday and the soft, steady changes in moonlight across the month. The moon, with its phases and its pull on the sea, has played a background role in that evolutionary story. Even though human sleep is primarily aligned with the day-night cycle of the Sunday, there is growing interest in how lunar phases might have subtle influences on sleep and behavior in some people. Some studies have found small shifts in sleep structure linked to the phase of the moon, like slight changes in how long it takes people to fall asleep, or how much deep sleep they get. Although the effects tend to be modest and not everyone experiences them the same way. It is an area where science is still untangling signal from noise, and researchers do not yet fully agree on how strong or consistent these lunar effects are. What is clear, though, is that night environments have changed. For most of human history, the waxing and waning of the moon's light would have made a visible difference in how bright the night sky was. A full moon over an open landscape can be surprisingly bright, casting pale shadows and turning the ocean into a silver sheet. A new moon, by contrast, makes the night feel very dark. Today, many of us live with artificial light that smooths out these differences. Street lamps, house lights, car headlights, and glowing screens all pour photons into the night. They can act like small, concentrated suns, shining right into the eyes, confusing the brain's sense of when night truly begins. This does not mean light at night is always bad. It can be beautiful, and it can be practical. But if you have ever found yourself awake late at night, staring at a bright screen, and then found it hard to fall asleep, you have felt how strongly light can tug on your inner tides. The particular wavelengths of light that are rich in blue tones are especially potent in sending wakeful signals through those light-sensitive retinal cells to the master clock, pushing melatonin downward and making your system feel more like daytime than night. One way to gently respect your own inner tides is to gradually shift your personal light ocean over the evening. Imagine the brightness in your surroundings as a high tide of light in the day and a gentle ebb toward dimness as bedtime approaches. As the night wears on, you can let that tide fall, choosing softer, warmer lights and giving your eyes a break from intense, close-up brightness. Even just turning a screen brightness down, using a warmer color setting, or stepping away from the screen sooner than usual can make the inner night feel more like an honest night. When the signals of darkness begin to reach your eyes more clearly, the master clock responds. Melatonin can rise more smoothly, and your body can shift more fully into its night phase, lowering your core temperature a bit, changing hormone patterns, and loosening the grip of daytime alertness. There is a kind of relief your system feels when the inner interpretation of time finally matches the outer reality of the sky. It is like a harbor whose tide chart has been updated to match the real moon again. You may have had evenings when you allowed this to happen almost by accident. Perhaps you took a walk at dusk without headphones and just let your eyes drink in the slowly fading light. Maybe you lit fewer lamps than usual, or read a book instead of looking at a bright screen, or sat in a dimly lit room listening to rain outside. On those nights, you might have noticed that sleep came a little more willingly, without as much tossing and turning. Your body, in those moments, was doing what the ocean does every day, simply following a quiet, dependable pull. There is something comforting about knowing that all this complex physiology, the hormones and the clock genes, the feedback loops and the nerve pathways, has evolved to give you exactly what you are leaning into right now, a way to rest and restore yourself in the dark hours. Sleep is not a mistake or a weakness. It is an ancient, deeply conserved process that almost every animal on Earth shares in its own way. Even creatures that live in the intertidal zone and seem so busy surviving the changing water levels take their own forms of rest, shifting into slower modes during certain parts of their tidal cycle. Out in the open ocean, whales and dolphins, birds and fish all find ways to rest their brains, sometimes sleeping one hemisphere at a time, sometimes gliding in currents, sometimes hiding in reefs. Rest is woven into the design of life, as necessary as feeding and breathing. When you lie down and close your eyes, you are not ignoring the world. You are joining it in one of its most universal behaviors. If you picture the Earth spinning slowly in space right now, with its blue oceans and curved continents and whorls of cloud, you can imagine that on the sunlit side, countless people are awake, working, talking, thinking, moving. On the dark side, countless others are asleep or drifting toward sleep. The line between those two halves curls constantly across the planet as day becomes night and night becomes day, and the moon traces its slow orbit around us, tugging at our seas. In that moving pattern, your own need to rest is just one small natural part. You might even notice that when you look back over your life, there have been seasons that felt like high tides, and seasons that felt like low tides, times when you felt full of energy and drive, and times when you felt like withdrawing and simplifying. Sometimes those cycles have followed the year. Longer days in the summer might have brought more activity. Longer nights in the winter might have led to more reflection, more time indoors, more dreams. Sometimes the cycles have been shaped by life events, by work, by relationships, by health. Through all those changes, The fundamental truth has been the same. Your body and mind work in rhythms. You are not meant to be constantly high tide, constantly productive and awake. You are meant to have regular low tides when energy recedes, when the shoreline of your awareness is exposed, when debris can be cleared and new life can settle quietly into place. Every time you allow yourself a night of deep rest, you are honoring that design. Right now, as you listen to these words, perhaps with the faint suggestion of ocean sounds behind them in your imagination, you are already participating in that low tide. You do not have to do anything flashy or impressive. You do not have to solve any problems. You can simply breathe and notice that the world is big enough to keep moving without you for a while. The moon will keep circling. The ocean will keep rising and falling along shores you have never seen. The stars will keep spinning slowly across the sky. Your internal clock will keep time, adjusting quietly to every morning and every evening. All of this will happen whether or not you are awake to watch it. There is a deep tranquility in trusting that. In coastal villages around the world, people have lived by the tides for centuries. Fishers wake at odd hours, not because the clock on the wall tells them to, but because the tide and the moon do. They learn the local patterns so well that they can feel in their bones when the water will be right for setting out to sea or bringing the boats back in. When the work is done, they rest. Sometimes in the middle of the day, sometimes in the dark, letting their own sleep cycle bend toward the rhythm of the coast. Their lives show that human time can flow in more than one way. For you, living perhaps far from any shore, the tides you follow are likely different. Alarm clocks, work hours, school schedules, social plans. Yet underneath all of that, there is still the quiet, wordless guidance of your inner rhythms. You may have had mornings when you woke just before your alarm, as if your body already knew the time. You may have had evenings when sleepiness swept over you gently, regardless of what the clock said, or afternoons when your energy dipped and a short rest made everything feel more manageable. These are your internal tides showing themselves. While society's schedules are not always flexible, there is often more room than it seems to gently align small parts of your day with what your body is asking for. It can be as simple as stepping outside into daylight, not long after you wake, or letting yourself have a more consistent bedtime, or dimming the room a bit earlier. Even small, steady adjustments can, over days and weeks, help your inner clock and your outer world flow together more smoothly. In scientific terms, you might say that you are strengthening the cues, sometimes called Zeitgebers, that help your circadian system stay entrained to the environment. In lived experience, it simply feels like life becoming a little bit easier and more predictable for your body. You may notice that in periods when you respect these inner cues, your sleep deepens, your mood stabilizes a little, your thoughts feel clearer. None of this needs to be perfect. Even the ocean's tides vary. Weather, wind, and pressure can push them a little higher or lower than predicted. Rivers can change their courses, coastlines erode. Yet, over long stretches of time, the pattern holds. High tide still comes. Low tide still returns. In the same way, your sleep will not be flawless every night. There will be evenings when you lie awake longer than you would like, nights when your mind feels busier, and mornings when you wake earlier or later than planned. But over weeks and months, if you allow your inner rhythms some room to breathe, they will continue to do what they are designed to do. bringing you back again and again to rest. There is something very gentle about embracing this. Instead of fighting wakefulness in the middle of the night with frustration, you can sometimes simply notice the tide is a little choppy tonight and soften your reaction. Instead of judging a sleepy day as a failure, you can think, this is a lower tide. Maybe I can move a little more slowly today, if that is possible. Even that small change in attitude can reduce the tension that sometimes blocks sleep. Right now, as you continue to listen, you might imagine that your own thoughts are like small boats on the surface of a harbor. Some of them are busy little fishing boats. Some are larger ships. They have been moving all day, coming and going, loaded with information, worries, tasks, memories. As night settles in, and as the inner tide of melatonin rises, it is as though the harbor master has gently called out that it is time to come in. One by one, the boats find their way back to the docks. Some come in quickly, others take their time, but eventually, most find a place to tie up. The water in the harbor becomes a little smoother. The lights on the boats are turned down. There is still motion. Water laps against the hulls. A rope creaks here and there. But the frantic rushing eases. You do not have to force every thought. Boat to dock. You can let some of them circle in the outer harbor for a while, knowing that as the night deepens and your inner tide continues to rise, even they will find rest. Your only job is to lie here on the soft shore of your own awareness and watch. If you wish, or simply turn inward and feel the gentle rocking. Your breath, in and out, is like the smallest tide of all. You can notice how the air feels cooler as you breathe in, slightly warmer as you breathe out. You can feel the looseness in your limbs, increasing with each exhale, as if tension were tiny grains of sand being pulled away from you with every passing wave. Somewhere far above, the moon is still moving slowly across the sky. You might picture it now, a pale disk against a dark backdrop, perhaps full and bright, perhaps a thin crescent, perhaps something in between. You do not have to know its exact phase or position. It is enough to sense that it is there, steady and reliable. It has pulled the oceans for longer than any creature now alive can remember. It has seen ice ages and warm periods, quiet seas and stormy coasts. Through all of that change, it has kept to its path. There is a quiet reassurance in that constancy. Your own life, with all of its uncertainties and challenges, still unfolds under that steady, circling presence. The same gravity that draws the waves up and down along distant shores also acts on you, ever so slightly. You do not feel it as a literal tug, but you are part of that same physical world. In a way, every time you close your eyes and allow yourself to surrender into sleep, you are cooperating with the universe's larger tendency toward rhythm and balance. You are, for a while, stepping out of the churning of thoughts and tasks and into something more ancient and simple. The cycle of rest and renewal. As you settle more deeply now, you can imagine that the story of tides and moons, of clocks and hormones, has done its quiet work. You understand enough to trust that your body is not your enemy. It wants to rest. It knows how to rest. Even if sleep has been difficult for you at times, the underlying machinery is still there, still trying, still responding to every small kindness you show it. Every softer light in the evening, every consistent bedtime, every moment of breathing that tells your nervous system it is safe to let go. Tonight, you have given yourself one more of those kindnesses, time and attention to learn about the invisible rhythms that support you. You have listened to the story of the ocean's tides and the moon's pull, of intertidal creatures and human histories, of the master clock and the nightly wave of melatonin that whispers, "It is dark now, you can rest." All of that knowledge can now sink below the surface, like sand disturbed by a wave that soon settles again. The details can drift away. You do not need to hold them tightly. What remains is a feeling, a quiet, grounded sense that it is natural to become sleepy when night falls, that it is natural to go still while the world continues to move, that you are not alone in your need for rest. All around the planet, oceans rise and fall, animals curl up in nests, burrows, and beds, and countless other people are letting go of their day. You are part of that great, unseen community of sleepers. With that in mind, you can let your attention relax. If your eyes are not already closed, you may let them close now, or let them half close in a soft, heavy gaze. Notice how your jaw can loosen a little more, your tongue resting comfortably, your shoulders dropping another fraction of an inch. Feel the surface beneath you supporting your weight so completely that you do not have to hold yourself up at all. In this supported, safe stillness, your inner tides will continue their quiet work. The clock in your brain will keep time. Melatonin will follow its nightly curve. Your breathing will slow and deepen. Your muscles will let go. Gradually, gently, you will drift, like a small boat carried on an incoming tide, away from the sharp edges of waking thought and into a softer, more spacious place, where images, sensations, and memories can rise and fall without effort. There is no need to watch for the exact moment this happens. In fact, it is almost impossible to see it as it occurs. One moment you are listening, the next you are somewhere else, following a different kind of story that only your dreaming mind can tell. When that happens, the words you are hearing will simply become another soft sound in the distance, like surf on a faraway beach. They will be part of the world you are leaving for a little while, a world that will be waiting for you when you return in the morning. For now, though, you can let yourself trust the process, the way the sea trusts the moon, and the way tide pools trust that the water will come back after it leaves. You can let go of the shore of waking awareness and allow yourself to be carried out on the slow, steady tide of sleep, knowing that this, too, is one of nature's most ancient, most reliable rhythms, and that you are entirely allowed to surrender to it. And as you feel yourself drifting a little deeper into that quiet inner ocean, if you've enjoyed resting here together, learning and wondering at this gentle pace, I'd love to invite you to stay connected. When you are awake again, or next time you are looking for something soft and thoughtful to fall asleep to, you can subscribe to this channel so you can always find your way back to this calm space. If this helped you unwind, a simple like on the video also lets me know that these slow, soothing journeys are valuable for you, and it helps more sleepy minds discover a place to rest as well. For now, you don't have to move or decide anything at all. You can just remember, somewhere in the back of your mind, that there will be more quiet explorations like this waiting for you whenever you need them. Thank you for spending this time here, for letting your body soften and your thoughts slow down. I'll be right here next time, ready to wander gently through another corner of science and philosophy with you. But for now, you can let all of that drift away and simply rest.